In the summer of 1896, beneath the scorching Egyptian sun at Medinet Habu, French archaeologist Émile Baraize carefully brushed away millennia of accumulated sand from the temple walls of Ramesses III, unknowingly preparing to unveil one of history's most enduring mysteries. As the hieroglyphic inscriptions emerged from their sandy tomb, revealing dramatic scenes of naval battles and foreign warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, Baraize could not have imagined that he was uncovering evidence of a civilization-ending catastrophe that had swept across the ancient world more than 3 millennia earlier. The reliefs depicted fierce maritime warriors descending upon Egypt's shores, their ships bearing strange symbols and their armies composed of peoples whose names would echo through archaeological literature for generations to come. The Peleset, the Tjeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, collectively known to modern scholars as the Sea Peoples. These enigmatic raiders had emerged from the mists of the late Bronze Age collapse, bringing with them not merely conquest and destruction, but a transformation so complete that it would reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, ending the age of great Bronze Age civilizations, and ushering in what historians would later term the Greek Dark Ages. The temple walls at Medinet Habu preserved the most detailed contemporary account of these mysterious invaders, describing them as a confederation of maritime peoples who had already devastated the great kingdoms of the Hittites, destroyed the mighty city of Ugarit, and left a trail of burned settlements across Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus before turning their attention to the wealth of pharaonic Egypt. Ramesses III's inscriptions speak of enemies who came from the midst of the sea, traveling in ships unlike any the Egyptians had previously encountered, accompanied by ox carts filled with women, children, and possessions, suggesting not merely raiding parties but entire populations in migration, seeking new lands to settle after some catastrophic event had displaced them from their original homelands. The archaeological evidence supports these ancient accounts, revealing a pattern of destruction and abandonment across the Eastern Mediterranean that begins around 1200 BCE and continues for several decades, with major Bronze Age centers like Pylos, Turin, and numerous Mycenaean palaces showing clear signs of violent destruction, often followed by periods of abandonment or dramatically reduced occupation. The Sea Peoples represent far more than a simple invasion narrative. They embody the complex interplay of climate change, political instability, technological innovation, and population movement that characterize one of history's most significant periods of transformation, when the interconnected palace economies of the late Bronze Age gave way to the emerging Iron Age city-states and kingdoms that would define the classical world. Modern archaeological techniques, including underwater exploration of shipwrecks, analysis of destruction layers through stratigraphic excavation, and scientific dating methods, have revealed that the Sea Peoples' impact extended far beyond military conquest, encompassing changes in settlement patterns, technological traditions, religious practices, and cultural identities that would influence Mediterranean civilizations for centuries to come. The mystery deepens when examining the material culture associated with these peoples, which reveals sophisticated metalworking techniques, distinctive pottery styles, and burial practices that suggest origins in multiple regions, from the Aegean Islands to southern Italy, from the western Mediterranean to the Black Sea coast, creating a puzzle that has challenged archaeologists and historians for more than a century. Their story unfolds against the backdrop of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period when the great international system that had connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange suddenly disintegrated, leaving behind the archaeological record of burned cities, abandoned settlements, and cultural discontinuity that marks the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of a new era in human history. The archaeological quest to understand the Sea Peoples begins with the painstaking work of excavating and interpreting the destruction layers that mark their passage through the ancient world. Layers that tell a story of sudden violence and dramatic change preserved in burned mud brick, scattered pottery sherds, and the skeletal remains of those who perished in the final moments of Bronze Age civilization. At the site of Ugarit, the great cosmopolitan port city on the Syrian coast that served as a crucial link between the Mediterranean world and the inland empires of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, French archaeologists led by Claude Scheffer uncovered dramatic evidence of the city's sudden and violent end around 1180 BCE, with destruction layers containing arrowheads, weapons, and signs of fierce combat in the streets and buildings, while tablets found in the ruins speak of urgent appeals for military assistance and warnings of approaching enemy fleets that would never arrive in time to save the city. The excavation of destruction layer IIB at Ugarit revealed that the attack came without warning, with evidence suggesting that the inhabitants were engaged in normal daily activities when disaster struck, leaving behind partially completed work in workshops, unfinished meals in houses, and valuable goods abandoned in their rush to flee or defend their homes. Similar patterns emerge at sites across the eastern Mediterranean, where archaeologists have identified what they term the 1200 BCE event horizon, a chronological marker that separates the late Bronze Age world of palace civilizations from the early Iron Age period of smaller, more localized settlements. At Tel Kazal in Syria, excavations have revealed multiple destruction episodes dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, with each rebuilding phase showing increasing signs of militarization, including thicker walls, defensive towers, and weapons caches that suggest the inhabitants were preparing for ongoing threats from seaborne raiders. The material culture from these destruction contexts provides crucial insights into the Sea people's identity and origins, with pottery assemblages showing influences from multiple traditions including Aegean, Cypriot, Anatolian, and Western Mediterranean styles, suggesting that the Confederation included groups from diverse geographical and cultural backgrounds united by their maritime mobility and military effectiveness. Underwater archaeology has contributed significantly to understanding the Sea peoples through the excavation of shipwrecks from the late Bronze Age period, particularly the famous Uluburun wreck off the Turkish coast, which, while predating the Sea peoples by several decades, demonstrates the sophisticated international trade networks that the raiders would later disrupt and destroy. The Uluburun ship's cargo, including Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot copper ingots, Canaanite jars filled with resin and glass beads, Baltic amber, African ivory, and tin from sources possibly as distant as Britain, illustrates the complex web of economic relationships that connected the Bronze Age world, and helps explain why the Sea people's disruption of maritime trade routes would have such devastating consequences for the palace economies that depended on these networks. At Cape Gelidonia, another Turkish shipwreck site dating to around 1200 BCE, archaeologists have recovered evidence of bronze working tools and scrap metal that may represent the kind of itinerant craftsmen and traders who could have formed part of the Sea People's Confederation, bringing with them not only military skills, but also technological knowledge that would contribute to the spread of ironworking and other innovations during the transition to the Iron Age. The archaeological evidence from Cyprus provides particularly rich insights into the Sea people's impact and transformation, with sites like Nkomi and Kishan showing clear destruction around 1200 BCE, followed by rebuilding phases that incorporate new architectural styles, pottery traditions, and settlement patterns that suggest the arrival of new populations, who merge with surviving local inhabitants to create hybrid cultures that combined elements of their original traditions with Cypriot practices. At Polypifos scales, the excavation of a large cemetery dating from the 11th to 8th centuries BCE has revealed burial practices that combine Aegean, Levantine, and local Cypriot elements, with grave goods including fibulae, weapons, and pottery that demonstrate the complex cultural mixing that occurred in the aftermath of the Sea people's migrations. The origins of the Sea peoples have been debated by scholars for over a century, with theories ranging from climate-induced migrations from the Aegean and Western Mediterranean to internal rebellions within the Bronze Age palace systems, each supported by different categories of archaeological and textual evidence that continue to fuel scholarly discussion and new research directions. The Aegean origin theory, first proposed by early 20th century scholars like Georg Caro and later developed by archaeologists such as Fritz Schachermer and Nancy Sanders, argues that the Sea peoples originated primarily in the Mycenaean world and related Aegean cultures, pointing to similarities between Sea peoples' material culture and Aegean traditions. The timing of Mycenaean palace collapses with the appearance of Sea peoples and Egyptian and Near Eastern sources and the presence of distinctively Aegean-style pottery and metalwork in destruction contexts associated with the raiders. This theory gained support from the fact that many of the ethnonyms used by Egyptian scribes to identify different Sea peoples groups can be plausibly connected to known Aegean locations, with the Peleset potentially deriving from a word related to the Aegean Sea itself, the Denyen possibly connected to the Danaoi, a term used by Homer to describe the Greeks, and the Weshesh potentially representing the Ahiyawa mentioned in Hittite texts as a major Aegean power, possibly the Mycenaean Greeks. However, the Western Mediterranean origin theory, advocated by scholars like Giovanni Lalou and more recently by Asaf Yasser Landau, suggests that at least some Sea peoples groups originated in Sardinia, Sicily, and southern Italy, pointing to the distinctive horned helmets depicted in Egyptian reliefs that closely resemble bronze figurines found at Sardinian Nuraghi sites. The presence of Nuragic pottery in late Bronze Age destruction contexts in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the potential connection between the Shekelesh and Sicily, whose ancient name was Cyclia. Archaeological evidence from Sardinia has revealed a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization centered on the Nuraghi towers, with evidence of metallurgical expertise, maritime trade connections, and warrior cultures that could have provided both the motivation and capability for long-distance raiding expeditions during periods of economic or environmental stress. The multi-regional origin theory, increasingly favored by contemporary scholars like Eric Klein and Israel Finkelstein, proposes that the Sea peoples represented a loose confederation of maritime groups from various regions around the Mediterranean, brought together by shared interests in raiding, trading, and settling in new territories during the political and economic instability of the late Bronze Age collapse. This theory helps explain the diversity of material culture, traditions found in Sea peoples' contexts, and the apparent coordination of their activities across vast distances and multiple campaigns against different targets. Recent DNA studies and isotope analysis of skeletal remains from sites associated with the Sea peoples are beginning to provide new insights into their origins, with preliminary results suggesting genetic diversity consistent with populations drawn from multiple Mediterranean regions, though the sample sizes remain small and the interpretation of ancient DNA data in relation to population movements continues to evolve as new techniques and larger data sets become available. The question of what triggered the Sea peoples' migrations remains equally complex, with scholars proposing various combinations of climate change, volcanic eruptions, earthquake activity, political instability, economic disruption, and social upheaval as potential catalysts for the population movements that brought different groups together in the maritime confederations that would terrorize the Bronze Age world. Paleoclimatic data from the Eastern Mediterranean indicates a period of increased aridity and cooling around 1200 BCE, which can have stressed agricultural systems and forced populations to seek new territories, while geological evidence suggests increased seismic activity in the Aegean region. During this period, potentially contributing to the collapse of Mycenaean palace centers and the displacement of their populations, the theory of systems collapse, developed by archaeologists like Colin Renfrew and applied to the Bronze Age by scholars like Susan Sherritt, suggests that the highly interconnected nature of late Bronze Age civilization made it particularly vulnerable to cascade failures, where disruption in one region could trigger a chain reaction of economic, political, and social breakdown that ultimately destabilized the entire system and created the conditions for widespread population, movement, and conflict. The first documented encounters between the sea peoples and the great powers of the Bronze Age world reveal a pattern of sudden, devastating attacks that caught established civilizations unprepared for the scale and coordination of these maritime raiders, beginning with scattered references in Hittite archives that speak of mysterious enemies from the sea threatening the empire's coastal territories and culminating in the dramatic confrontations with Egypt that would be memorialized in stone at Medinet Habu and other royal monuments. The Hittite archives from Bacchus Kali, the ancient capital of Hattusa, contain fragmentary references to seaborne threats that appear in the final decades of the empire, including letters between Hittite kings and their vassals discussing defensive preparations against unspecified maritime enemies and requests for naval assistance to protect coastal cities from attack. A particularly intriguing document, sometimes called the Tawagalawa letter, mentions conflicts involving Ahiyawa forces and Western Anatolian kingdoms that may represent early sea peoples' activity, while other texts refer to the need to fortify harbors and coastal settlements against raiders who strike without warning from the sea. The destruction of the Hittite port city of Troy, immortalized in Greek epic poetry, but confirmed by archaeological excavation to have occurred around 1180 BCE, may represent one of the Sea People's most significant early victories, with the sites showing clear evidence of violent destruction, including burned buildings, scattered weapons, and hasty burials that suggest a sudden and overwhelming attack. Archaeological evidence from the Hittite heartland reveals a pattern of abandonment and destruction at major centers, including Hattusa itself, where excavations have uncovered evidence of systematic burning and the hasty burial of valuable objects, suggesting that the capital was deliberately destroyed rather than simply abandoned, possibly by the Sea Peoples or by Hittite authorities themselves to prevent valuable resources from falling into enemy hands. The collapse of the Hittite Empire around 1180 BCE left a power vacuum in Anatolia that the Sea Peoples were quick to exploit, with evidence suggesting that some groups established permanent settlements in former Hittite territories, particularly along the southern and western coasts, where they could maintain their maritime orientation while controlling lucrative trade routes. In the Levant, the impact of the Sea Peoples is visible at numerous sites, including Hazor, one of the most important Canaanite cities of the Late Bronze Age, where excavations by Yigael Yadin revealed massive destruction layers dating to around 1230 BCE, with evidence of intense burning that destroyed the upper city's palaces and temples, while leaving behind scattered weapons and signs of fierce combat in the streets. The destruction of Ugarit, as mentioned earlier, represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of Sea People's impact, with the site's archives preserving urgent correspondence that captures the final moments of a great Bronze Age city, including a letter from the king of Alashia's Cyprus warning Ugarit's ruler that enemy ships have been sighted approaching the coast and urging immediate defensive preparations. The last letter found in the Ugarit archives, discovered in an oven where it was apparently being baked when the city fell, comes from a Hittite official who writes desperately, "The enemy advances against us, and there is no number to them. They are more numerous than the sand of the sea," a phrase that echoes the biblical descriptions of invading armies and suggests the psychological impact of facing an enemy whose numbers seemed limitless. Archaeological work at Ugarit has revealed that the city's destruction was total and final, with no significant reoccupation in subsequent periods, unlike many other ancient cities that were rebuilt after conquest, suggesting that the Sea People's attack was not simply a raid for plunder, but part of a larger strategy of territorial occupation and settlement. The material culture from Ugarit's destruction layer includes weapons and pottery that show clear Aegean influences, supporting theories about the Sea People's origins while also revealing the international character of the city's final defenders, who appear to have included mercenaries and allies from various Mediterranean cultures. The pattern observed at Ugarit is repeated at numerous other sites throughout the Levant and Eastern Mediterranean, where destruction layers from around 1200 BCE contain similar combinations of local and foreign material culture, suggesting that the Sea Peoples' campaigns involved not only military conquest, but also significant population movement and cultural mixing that would reshape the demographic and cultural landscape of the region for centuries to come. The Great Naval Battle between the Sea Peoples and Ramesses III of Egypt, immortalized in the magnificent reliefs at Medinet Habu, represents the climactic confrontation between the Bronze Age world's last great power and the maritime confederation that had already brought down empires and devastated civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean, a clash that would determine whether Egypt would share the fate of the Hittites and other fallen kingdoms or successfully resist the tide of invasion that had swept away the established order. The Egyptian sources, including the Great Harris Papyrus and the temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu, provide the most detailed contemporary account of the Sea Peoples' appearance, describing them as a confederation of foreign peoples who had devastated the lands of the north, before turning their attention to the wealth and stability of pharaonic Egypt, bringing with them not only warriors but entire populations seeking new territories to settle. Migrations created new patterns of settlement, trade, and cultural organization that fundamentally altered the structure of Mediterranean civilization, replacing the hierarchical palace economies of the Bronze Age with more decentralized systems, based on independent city-states, regional federations, and specialized craft communities that would provide the foundation for classical antiquity's political and economic institutions. The collapse of the Great Bronze Age trade networks that had connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean through standardized exchange systems and diplomatic protocols created both challenges and opportunities for the Sea Peoples and other survivors of the late Bronze Age crisis, forcing communities to develop new approaches to resource acquisition, craft production, and interregional contact that emphasize local self-sufficiency, while maintaining selective connections to distant markets and sources of raw materials. Archaeological evidence from Sea Peoples settlement sites reveals a gradual shift from the imported luxury goods and exotic materials that characterized Bronze Age palace inventories toward locally produced items and regional trade networks that reflected both reduced access to long-distance exchange systems and new preferences for practical, durable goods that better suited the needs of communities, focused on establishing secure territorial bases and developing sustainable economic foundations. The pottery assemblages from Philistine sites like Ashdod and Tel Es Safi show this transition clearly, with early levels containing ceramics that closely resemble Mycenaean and other Aegean traditions, followed by increasingly localized forms that incorporate Canaanite techniques and decorative styles, while maintaining distinctive elements that preserve Sea Peoples' cultural identity, demonstrating how these communities balance cultural continuity with practical adaptation to new environmental and social conditions. The development of iron technology represents one of the most significant technological innovations associated with the Sea Peoples period, though archaeological evidence suggests that the transition from bronze to iron working was gradual and varied considerably between different regions and communities, with some areas continuing to rely primarily on bronze tools and weapons for centuries, while others quickly adopted and refined ironworking techniques to produce superior implements for both military and civilian use. At Tel Kassel, excavations have revealed evidence of sophisticated ironworking facilities dating to the early Philistine period, including furnaces, tools, and slag deposits that demonstrate advanced metallurgical knowledge and suggest that some Sea Peoples groups brought with them expertise in iron production that gave them significant advantages in both military and economic competition with communities that continued to rely on bronze technology. The agricultural impact of Sea Peoples settlements is visible in the archaeological record, through changes in crop types, field systems, and storage facilities that reflect both the environmental knowledge that migrants brought from their original homelands and their adaptation to local conditions in their new territories, creating hybrid agricultural systems that often proved more productive and sustainable than earlier approaches. At Ekron, the massive olive oil production facilities that dominated the site during the 7th century BCE represent the culmination of centuries of agricultural development that combined Mediterranean expertise in olive cultivation with local knowledge of soil conditions and climate patterns, creating an industry that supported not only local consumption but also extensive export trade that connected Philistine communities to markets throughout the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The social organization of Sea Peoples communities appears to have differed significantly from both the hierarchical palace systems of the Bronze Age and the tribal structures of many indigenous populations, developing instead flexible forms of collective leadership and specialized role differentiation that allowed these communities to maintain military effectiveness while pursuing diverse economic activities and cultural practices. Archaeological evidence from various Sea Peoples sites suggests the emergence of warrior elites who combined military leadership with mercantile activities, religious authority, and craft specialization, creating social systems that were both more egalitarian than Bronze Age palace societies and more complex than simple tribal organizations, providing models for the citizen-soldier ideals and mixed economies that would characterize many classical city-states. The religious and cultural practices of Sea Peoples communities reveal similar patterns of synthesis and innovation, combining imported traditions with local practices to create distinctive religious systems that preserved ancestral identities while adapting to new geographical and social environments, as evidenced by excavated temples, burial grounds, and ritual deposits that show influences from multiple Mediterranean traditions integrated into coherent ceremonial complexes. The military innovations and tactical developments associated with the Sea Peoples represent one of their most significant contributions to the transformation of ancient warfare, introducing new weapons technologies, naval strategies, and organizational methods that would influence Mediterranean military traditions for centuries and contribute to the emergence of the citizen soldier armies and professional maritime forces that characterize the classical period. The archaeological record reveals that Sea Peoples warriors employed a distinctive combination of weapons and armor that differed markedly from traditional Bronze Age military equipment, including long straight swords suitable for both thrusting and slashing, round shields that provided greater mobility than the tower shields used by many Bronze Age armies, and specialized naval weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat and amphibious operations. Excavations at various Sea Peoples sites have uncovered weapon hoards and individual finds that demonstrate advanced metallurgical techniques in sword production, including sophisticated methods for creating composite blades with hard cutting edges and flexible cores that represented significant improvements over earlier bronze weapons and anticipated the development of classical iron and steel weaponry. The distinctive feathered headdresses and horn helmets depicted in Egyptian reliefs and found in archaeological contexts suggest that Sea Peoples warriors placed significant emphasis on visual identification and psychological intimidation, developing elaborate ceremonial equipment that served both practical protective functions and important social and religious roles in warrior culture and military organization. The naval innovations associated with the Sea Peoples are particularly significant, as their ship designs and maritime tactics represented major advances over earlier Mediterranean naval traditions, incorporating features like high prows and sterns, birdhead decorations, and specialized deck arrangements that improved both seaworthiness and combat effectiveness, while creating vessels that were distinctively associated with Sea Peoples' identity and maritime dominance. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and harbor installations suggests that Sea People's naval technology included innovations in sail design, steering systems, and cargo handling that enhanced both military and commercial maritime capabilities, contributing to the expansion of Mediterranean trade networks and the development of more sophisticated approaches to long-distance maritime transportation. The tactical flexibility demonstrated by Sea People's forces in their campaigns against various Bronze Age powers reveals sophisticated military planning and coordination capabilities that allowed them to adapt their strategies to different geographical conditions, enemy capabilities, and logistical constraints while maintaining the strategic initiative across multiple theaters of operation over extended periods. The combination of land and sea operations that characterize major Sea People's campaigns, as documented in Egyptian sources and supported by archaeological evidence from various battle sites, demonstrates advanced understanding of amphibious warfare principles and joint operations that would become standard elements of classical military doctrine, but were apparently novel in the Bronze Age context. The integration of civilian populations in the Sea People's military movements, evidenced by the ox carts filled with families that accompanied warrior bands, suggests innovative approaches to logistics and settlement that allowed these communities to maintain military pressure on enemies while simultaneously establishing permanent territorial bases and economic foundations in conquered regions. Archaeological evidence from fortified settlements and defensive installations associated with Sea People's communities reveal sophisticated understanding of siege warfare, defensive architecture, and military engineering that incorporated innovations from various Mediterranean traditions, while developing new techniques suited to their particular strategic needs and tactical preferences. The influence of Sea People's military innovations extended far beyond their own communities, as evidenced by the adoption of their weapons, tactics, and organizational methods by other Mediterranean peoples, including the Egyptians who incorporated Sea People's warriors into their own military forces and adapted their naval techniques for use in pharaonic fleets. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of technological transfer and tactical borrowing that spread Sea People's innovations throughout the Mediterranean world, contributing to the development of more effective and sophisticated military capabilities that would characterize Iron Age warfare and provide foundations for the military achievements of classical civilizations. The psychological and cultural impact of Sea People's military success is reflected in ancient literary traditions and historical accounts that preserved memories of their prowess and innovations, influencing later Mediterranean concepts of warrior honor, naval supremacy, and military excellence that would shape classical ideals of heroism and martial virtue. The cultural and religious dimensions of Sea People society reveal complex systems of belief and practice that combined ancestral traditions from their various origins with new influences encountered during their migrations and settlements, creating distinctive religious expressions that preserved essential elements of group identity, while adapting to diverse geographical and social environments throughout the Mediterranean world. Archaeological excavations at Sea People's sites have uncovered evidence of sophisticated religious architecture, including temples and shrines that show influences from Aegean, Anatolian, Levantine, and other Mediterranean traditions integrated into coherent ceremonial complexes that served both local community needs and broader regional religious functions. At Tel Qasl, excavations have revealed a sequence of temples dating from the 12th to 10th centuries BCE that demonstrate the evolution of Philistine religious practices over time, beginning with simple structures that closely resemble Aegean religious architecture and developing into more complex facilities that incorporate Canaanite architectural elements and ceremonial features while maintaining distinctive characteristics that preserve Sea People's cultural identity. The religious artifacts found at various Sea People sites, including cult statues, ceremonial vessels, and votive offerings, reveal the integration of multiple iconographic traditions and symbolic systems that reflect both the diverse origins of sea peoples' communities and their interactions with indigenous populations in their new territories, creating hybrid religious expressions that combine imported and local elements into new forms of sacred art and ritual practice. The burial practices documented at sea peoples' cemeteries provide particularly rich evidence for religious beliefs and social organization, with excavations at sites like Azekah and Tel Safi revealing burial customs that combine cremation and inhumation practices in ways that differ from both Aegean and Canaanite traditions, suggesting the development of distinctive mortuary rituals that reflected sea peoples' concepts of death, afterlife, and community continuity. The grave goods found in sea peoples' burials include combinations of weapons, jewelry, pottery, and other objects that reflect both military values and religious beliefs, with particular emphasis on items that may have served as markers of ethnic identity and social status within these immigrant communities, helping to maintain cultural cohesion and group solidarity across generations of settlement and new territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that sea peoples' religious practices included significant maritime elements, with cult sites often located near harbors or on coastal promontories, and religious artifacts that incorporate nautical symbols and marine motifs, reflecting the continued importance of seafaring in both practical and spiritual aspects of community life. The linguistic evidence associated with sea peoples' communities, though limited and often difficult to interpret, suggests the preservation of non-Semitic language traditions, alongside the gradual adoption of local languages, creating multilingual environments that facilitated both internal community cohesion and external diplomatic and commercial relationships. Inscriptions found at Philistine sites include examples of both local scripts and what may be remnants of Aegean or other Mediterranean writing systems, suggesting complex patterns of literacy and cultural transmission that help preserve ancestral knowledge while enabling successful integration into new regional contexts. The artistic traditions associated with sea peoples' communities reveal sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities that combine various Mediterranean influences into distinctive decorative styles visible in pottery, metalwork, textiles, and architectural decoration, creating visual cultures that both preserved ancestral identities and expressed adaptation to new environments and social conditions. The technological knowledge preserved and transmitted by sea peoples' communities included not only military and maritime innovations but also advances in crafts like pottery production, textile manufacture, metallurgy, and agricultural processing that contributed to the economic success of their settlements and influenced technological development throughout their regions of settlement. The educational and cultural transmission systems that enabled sea peoples' communities to maintain their distinctive identities while successfully adapting to new circumstances appear to have emphasized practical skills, cultural memory, and flexible adaptation strategies that allowed these communities to preserve essential elements of their heritage while embracing innovations and opportunities encountered in their new homelands, creating resilient cultural systems that